Hello, everybody. This is Dr. G.E. Carlin, and I wanted to just make a quick video to talk to you a little bit about my journey out of preterism. Well, if I'm going to talk about my journey out of preterism, I need to talk to some degree about my journey into preterism. Now, I don't have any um, time restraints on this or any notes or anything like that. I just really wanted to kind of talk about what got me into preterism and then why I left preterism. And so this is kind of off the fly. I don't have, like I said, I don't have like a lot of notes or anything like that. I'm just going to talk about my experience and my um, disheartened view of preterism or my journey out, that kind of thing. So anyway, with that fumbling through those words, let's go ahead and begin by talking about my journey into preterism. But before I do that, let me just say this. I'm not a futurist. I'm not a dispensationalist. If you're one of those dispensationalists who really trying to stick it to preterists like Kenneth Gentry and Gary DeMar and what you might have heard from like Greg Bonson and even Jay Adams and stuff like that, you're going to be sorely disappointed because I am not a futurist. The slight, maybe edge of futurism I hold to, but I actually idealist camp. I went from preterism into the idealist camp. Um, and I'm in that idealist camp that's held by people like J.K. Beale, that believes that the book of Revelation tells a story of the church age basically 7 times. Um, so I hold that. I'm more of idealism. So I didn't leave preterism for dispensationalism, but I left preterism for what I thought was in this what preterism says they believe, but really doesn't. And then the seeds of what they believe. Okay, so that's really what I. Um, so my journey into preterism was interesting. So I was born in the early 70s. And at that time, Calvary Chapel was huge. And I kind of grew up in Calvary Chapels and breathing Calvary Chapel air kind of thing, kind of just a non denominational church going kind of thing. And I was born in Southern California. And about the age of 7, I moved to Utah, and we actually became LDS for a couple years, and then we got out of LDS through. This is another story all on its own. Through Dr. Walter Martin, listened to his tape, The Maze of Mormonism, got out of that. Well, my mom was married to my stepdad, and there was a divorce, and we ended up moving to another place in southern Utah, and um, we decided to start going back to church. My mom did. My mom dragged me back to church. I really wasn't interested in going to church at the time, but we went to a non-denominational church, very much Calvary Chapel kind of playing the guitar, the leftover kind of hippie kind of thing, the Jesus people movement. The pastor was a 5 Point Calvinist, and he was also a partial preterist. Now, when I say preterist, I'm sorry if I disappoint you. I didn't come out of full preterism. I came out of partial preterism. So I came out of what's called Orthodox preterism. Now, during those early years, issues regarding preterism and dispensationalism and stuff like that really didn't like. I wasn't thinking about those things a whole lot. I was really thinking more about the 5 points of Calvinism. That's really where my brain was focused, and my theological attention was focused on the 5 points of Calvinism. And so I was really studying that, but I knew he had this view of preterism, a partial preterism, and I was kind of interested in the Book of Revelation at the time, and I was just like, okay, what's your view? And he kind of laid out things, the typical preterist. It says soon and near, and these symbols can be cast, and especially in Matthew 24, these symbols can be cast to represent the fall of Jerusalem to the Romans, and it says this generation, and you go, and then that becomes your baseline in which you interpret everything else. Um, and then that kind of idea is pushed over into the book of Revelation as well, where it says these things are about to happen, they're soon to take place, and that you can kind of recast all these symbols to fit um, to fit um, AD 70. And so I was when I wasn't in Utah for a while. I went to school in Texas, and then I went to Israel. And just during that time, um, I was reading my Bible, and I was reading my Bible, and of course, being in school in Texas, and going to Israel, there's a lot of dispensational talk. And I was reading my Bible, and I was finding anything but dispensationalism. And I really didn't understand the systems at that point. I really didn't understand the real difference between dispensationalism and futurism in general, and preterism and historicism and idealism. I had no idea. I had no idea of any of that at the time. I was just reading my Bible. Part of what troubled me about dispensationalism and a rapture and all this stuff is I kept reading that, especially in the Gospels and stuff, is that when Jesus comes, it seems like it's going to be over. It doesn't seem like there's this 7 year period where the church is off the earth. It just didn't seem that way to me. Now, I at the time I claimed I was no expert. I claimed, I was just reading it and going, I just don't see this idea. It seems like people are here, that Christians are here during the tribulation, and so I was kind of getting turned off towards dispensationalism. And so when I came back home and reconnected with that pastor, um, he was already into like people like Greg Bonson and Kenneth Gentry. And so we started getting tapes from Covenant Media. It was called Covenant Tape Ministry at the time, and then it became Covenant Media Foundation. And we started getting a bunch of tapes from them. This is, mid 90s at this point. And of course, I became a full blown partial preterist, a full blown partial preterist. I mean, just totally believe that. Dispensationalists are stupid. They see that the book of Revelation totally fits Matthew 24, especially, but the book of Revelation. And the one thing that I never really did go through was the book of Revelation. I had Matthew 24 pretty much sewed up because the tapes and lectures and books on there are much easier than going through the book of Revelation. And the problem with going through the book of Revelation with like a commentary was for me was I couldn't read very well, even during that time. Like I couldn't read. I can't read very well now. And it's been a huge challenge for me to go through school, all the way through school, receive a doctorate, and have such struggle with reading. But again, that's another story. Um, so, I mean, there was these books, and we had Before Jerusalem Fell. And it was complicated, and I was not reading at the time. But if you gave me tapes, I'd listen to them, and I'd go through my Bible and listen to them and write notes. And I was really convinced of partial preterism. And then the wheels started to fall off a little bit. They started to fall off a little bit. At the time, I was getting into um, eschatology very heavily, very heavily. And I decided to kind of take a break from it for a little while, because I was just like, everything I was thinking about and was driving everything, and people were sick of hearing it from me. And I wasn't sick of talking about it, but I realized that it was becoming a lopsided issue in my theology. So I just gave it up for a while, and I would read the book of Revelation. I would think like, I wonder, how Greg Bonson would handle this. How does this fit into? And I never knew. I never knew until later how they cast those symbols in the Book of Revelation into AD 70. But it seemed monumentous. It just seemed totally huge. And I just didn't have the money to buy the 81 lectures or the 73 lectures or whatever it is from Covenant Tape Ministry over the Book of Revelation by Dr. Bonson. Occasionally, now we're starting getting into the explosion of the internet and stuff. And I had a really difficult time with some of the inconsistencies. Now, this is really what got me out of preterism. Now, I was a preterist, I was a partial preterist and a post millennialist. Of course, those two things go together. It's like peanut butter and jelly. So, normally if somebody says I'm a post millennialist, they're a partial preterist. Not always, but most of the time. And somebody says I'm a partial preterist, they say they believe they're post millennialists. So I was reading my the book of Revelation. I was reading the book of Revelation, and it just seemed. And I was listening to people online now, like Kenneth Gentry and Gary DeMar, and those kind of people. And there were some things, and this is really, really what started to bother me about preterism and push me away from it. Okay, this is the issue that I had. It was that they were inconsistent in their interpretation of symbols, and particularly symbols concerning numbers. And they would do with symbols and numbers to AD 70 what the futurist and dispensationalists do to symbols and numbers for the future in our modern time. Okay. And I found them to be very inconsistent. I found them to be pointing out issues in dispensationalism which they themselves had. Well, what do I mean by this? Let me give you a clear example of this. Often, and I participated in this, I would mock a dispensationalist because he would want to do like number 10 literally, and the 10 nations, and how New Rome's it's divided up into 10, and how the 1,000 years is a literal 1,000 years. And I, like all my preterist friends, would say things like, oh, don't these idiots know that uh, the book of Revelation is symbolic, and that you can't take numbers literally? Okay, all right. The seven-headed dragon. Okay, it's just they just don't see it. They're all trying to fit this in with 10 nations and a literal 1,000 years. Meanwhile, I was doing and listening to people who would do things to the book of Revelation, like say, see, book of Revelation talks about this 42 months. And 42 months from the time of the first rebellion to the time that Jerusalem fell was exactly 42 months, exactly 3.5 years. Um, and I would mock dispensationalists for using numbers literally. And then we would get to the seven mountains and say, see, Rome sits on seven hills. And if you count from Julius Caesar, you get down to Titus, who invaded uh, um, Jerusalem. You get down to five have fallen, one is, and one's to come. And the one that is, if you count those, and you start with Julius, and you go Octavius, and you go anyway, it goes down, and you get to five, and you get to that fifth one, and that fifth one is, he says, one is, and that's Nero. See, and if you take Nero and you add up his number, it's 666. See, so when we did numbers to fit into our system, it was okay. When they did numbers to fit into their system, well, they're a bunch of idiots who didn't know how to interpret the book of Revelation, not knowing that it's symbolic. So that's what really started to drive me away from dispensationalism. Drive me away from preterism. Let me tell you what preterism is. It is failed dispensationalism. So if you look at what the dispensationalists were doing 20 years ago, and all those prophecies are now old. Now, all those prophecies, all those things that the dispensationalists were saying was happening right now, it didn't happen. It's all gone. They were saying things like, oh, Henry Kissinger is the Antichrist. and they read the paper, and you can, see all these things, and this is just like the book of Revelation. This is just, well, nobody 20 years from later now believes that those were fulfillments of the book of Revelation. Those futurists today are still looking to the future. Preterists, they do the same thing, but they do it with the paper of that era. They do it with Josephus. Okay, Josephus is just the journalist of that era. And they're looking at Josephus going, oh man, this is just like the book of Revelation. I mean, if you take this and you turn this over into here and you put this there and then it is the book of Revelation. Then that's just exactly what they're doing. They're making fun of the dispensationalists who are doing that, but they're doing the same thing, except for instead of the New York Times, it's the paper of the first century. It is the Josephus Times. They're reading Josephus Times and fitting all the symbols of Revelation there into the same way these dispensationalists are doing it every generation. So that's really what kind of got me out. Plus, then I of course I believed the some of the premises of what they're saying, that the book of Revelation is a symbolic book telling a picture of symbols. The question is what is this? What it is it a symbol of? And this is where I think that the preterists kind of play a little bit of sleight of hand. They show you one thing and then they fill it in with something else. What do I mean by that? Well, so the dispensationalists are the only ones who kind of think that we should interpret the book of Revelation literally unless you can't. Okay, that's basically their motto, and that basically what John was seeing was pictures of the future, and he's trying to write them down. Okay, so a preterist will then argue that the book of Revelation should be interpreted symbolically, and they're right. But then what they fail to argue is why the book of Revelation should be taken as symbols for what they say it is. See, that's another step altogether. Just because you can prove the book of Revelation is symbolic in nature does not then therefore prove that those symbols are interpreted according to what you want to interpret them to be. See, that takes another step. And when they would argue that the book of Revelation was a book that was symbolic in nature, then when they would apply that to AD 70, they were making all the same mistakes that dispensationalist makes, all the same ones. So 7 becomes literal for them if it's applied to Rome. 7 is not literal when a dispensationalist tries to apply it to some future event or some modern event. 1,000 is not to be taken literally because dispensationalists, that's stupid because dispensationalists, they don't understand that the book of Revelation is symbolic. But 42 months is to be taken literally because that fits my system. So you have to squeeze it to fit the system that you want it to be in. And that's why I started giving up. And then at that time too, I was listening to a guy by the name of Arturo Zerdia, and also another guy that came close to that same position, D.A. Carson. And I was listening to their interpretation of the book of Revelation. They seem to be much more consistent with the symbolic nature of the book of Revelation than either the preterist or the futurist. So I kind of abandoned the preterist position. Also, there just seemed to be things that didn't fit into a preterist position. Things like the martyrs will cry under the altar until their number is complete. Well, I didn't know that the number of the martyrs was complete in AD 70, or even extended to the destruction of Jerusalem or the destruction of Rome. I didn't know that. That was interesting. That was interesting to find out that the time of the martyrs has been sealed. Also, it talks about when they do this whole 42 months, and it says that Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. Well, I didn't know the time of the Gentiles was fulfilled in AD 70. Well, what do you know? We're not in the time of the Gentiles anymore. What time are we in exactly then? Um, and also in Revelation 11, it talks about that you um, the outer court is given to the Gentiles, but the inner court is reserved off. It's reserved off. Yeah, how does that apply, Titus? He destroyed the whole thing. That can't be the literal temple. He didn't. It's not like he got up to the holy of holies and stopped. He destroyed all of it. So please don't tell me this is about Titus destroying Jerusalem and this exact 42 months. No, that's a symbolic representation of the entirety of the church. The 3.5 years, the times half a time, the 42 months, and the 1,000 years are all symbolic representation of what's happening during the entirety of the church era. Now, it wasn't my point here to defend my position at this point. I have lots of videos on this channel that you can look at where I talk about the book of Revelation. I'm still into it. I still like it a lot. I try not to be lopsided in my theology, but it's a little difficult because I do like the book of Revelation. I do like related issues like covenant theology, new covenant theology, dispensational theology, talking about that kind of stuff. So I went away from interpreting the book of Revelation that way for a while, but I was still holding on to Matthew chapter 24. Now, again, I don't have time to tell you what my view about Matthew 24 is now. It's the same view that D.A. Carson holds, if that helps you. And I've got videos on this channel, about 4 of them, talking about unlocking Matthew 24. Real briefly, though, I do believe that it's about the entirety of the church age, with special reference to um, the fall of Jerusalem. I do believe that plays a part in what Jesus was talking about. But let me just give you a quick refutation in case you're ever dealing with a or preterist. I keep saying dispensational, so I'm sorry. On Matthew chapter 24, in case you're ever dealing with somebody on Matthew 24, there are a couple of zingers I like to give them, and I'm going to give you a couple of them that they just can't. They haven't thought about it. They just can't answer. They're a little uppity. They're a little snooty, like, oh, we have this figured out, you dumb futurists, or a bunch of morons. And it's I'm not a futurist either, so I understand why they would think that way in some respects. But this is one verse that I use when I'm talking with them that they have not yet been able to answer at all. Okay. And I will tell them about I'll take them to Matthew 24 and I'll read verse 15 and 16. And basically it says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who's on the housetop go down, not take out of his house. And it goes on with some first century stuff here. In verse 20 it says, pray that your flight might not be on the Sabbath. And I stopped there and I always ask them, do you think that's about the destruction of Jerusalem? And they always say yes. And I say, I do too. Okay. Now go down to verse 29. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be dark. So if that's talking about AD 70, this is after AD 70. Because it says after the tribulation of those days. Now, I think that, again, I don't have time to defend my position in this video, but I have other videos where I do defend the position. But I think the tribulation of those days includes AD 70 and is all the way up to the return of Christ. So immediately after the tribulation of those days, you see. So what happens next is after AD 70. Can't be included in AD 70. And I have not yet heard a good answer from them on that. Anyway, signing off here. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe. Please comment. Please share. And I'm going to try to do more of these videos on hot topics. So we will talk to you soon. God bless.